Let's give folks a reintroduction of like your background and where you got into the industry and how
why are you qualified to teach us about distilling?
Like, let's go ahead. Like, where's your degree here?
I was the only one you could get to sit down.
Exactly. He's the only one to answer our calls.
This is episode 263 of Bourbon Pursuit, the podcast featuring news, reviews, and interviews with people making the bourbon whiskey industry happen. And before we start the podcast, here's your weekly bourbon news update. Last week, we revealed the news first on social media that a demolition permit has been submitted to take down the 130-year-old National Distillers Rickhouse in Louisville, Kentucky. The building has been deemed unsafe by structural engineers. There is a partial collapse of the roof, and the interior support beams are deteriorating with significant amount of mold buildup. It's sad to see this historic building be torn down after all the years of neglect since it was never being used. Now on to bourbon release news. The 2020 edition of Yellowstone Limited Edition Kentucky Straight Bourbon will be on shelves in September, featuring a 7-year-old straight bourbon finished in French Armagnac barrels. Approximately 5,000 cases of this bourbon are being produced at Limestone Branch Distillery, bottled at 101 proof, and will have a suggested retail price of $99.99. In Bourbon Pursuit news, we're continuing to select more and more barrels for our private bourbon club. This week, we selected 2 more barrels at Four Roses, an OESV and an OBSQ, both 10.5 years old. This is going to make 22 barrels selected so far this year, and we're not done yet. So if you want to see how you can support this podcast and get access to some great private barrels, along with first access to Pursuit series, join us, patreon.com/Bourbon Pursuit. And this is one podcast we were super excited to record. Way back on episode 88, we did a back to basics about bourbon, and now we're going deep dive into the distillation process. It's all the hard questions on distillation that we wanted to know, and we've got Tripp Stimson from Barrell Bourbon here to go all scientific on us. Listen close to the expert because it's definitely one of those shows where you're going to learn something new about the distillation process. Bourbon Pursuit's up for a People's Choice Award for podcasts, and we need your help. Go to podcastawards.com and register to vote as a listener. I know, registering sucks, but please, vote for us in the People's Choice and the Arts category. It would be really awesome to win this thing. Now, do you want to get some awesome bourbon, rye, and rums shipped straight to your door? Barrell Bourbon now has online ordering. You can get their award-winning products right now. Go to barrelbourbon.com and click the Buy Now button. With that, enjoy today's episode, and here's Fred Minnick with Above the Char.
I'm Fred Minnick, and this is Above the Char. As I hold this Old Forester 1897 in my hands, I turn it to the back and I read this quote. "The truth is, I prefer whiskey." Laura Howard. And that's from The Alienness, a TNT show. There's like an engraving on here. Not really entirely sure what the connection between Old Forester and The Alienist is. I'm sure it's in a press release or something that was emailed to me that I just didn't read. But I will say the bottle got me to thinking about all of the incredible moments bourbon has had in pop culture. Whether you want to talk about Blanton's being everywhere, of Pappy Van Winkle being written into The Interns, or Justified basically pouring more bourbon than most people do in their lifetime on a single episode. Or you want to go back to, the 1960s where it was seemingly on every single show with a man smoking a cigarette in a back corner. But I'll tell you, my favorite connection to Hollywood is The Hustler. JTS Brown is basically a drink of choice, and they talk about bourbon and its qualities that, you didn't really see a lot of. Most people, when bourbon is in the conversation, it's just part of the conversation. Like, here's a drink. Taste it. Is it good? Do you like it? Yeah, let's keep talking about taxes or killing Uncle John or whatever. Whereas in like The Hustler, they actually did talk about how it was made. They talked about it, 8-year-old bourbon being the very best, and so forth and so on. And so if you get a chance and you want to go down like movie lane and you want to watch an old flick while you're quarantined and bored up to your eyeballs, go check out the movie The Hustler. And while you're doing it, make sure you're pouring yourself a little JTS Brown. While it may not be the same, it's pretty cool to drink the same thing as Paul Newman. And that's this week's Above the Char. Hey, if you have an idea for Above the Char, hit me up on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, or whatever. Just look for my name, Fred Minnick. Until next week, cheers.
Welcome back to the episode of Bourbon Pursuit, the official podcast of bourbon. Kenny and Ryan back in our usual recording station with a friend of the show. It's been on here a few times already, but this time we're taking this kind of the next level because this was a listener requested show of saying like, listen, like we understand, we go on the tours, we get the 51% stuff all the time, but like, we need to answer some hard questions. And, we always go back, and I think it was like February 2018, we did like a back to basics sort of month way back then. And we kind of got an overview of some of this, but this time I'm really excited because we're going to be going deep dive into the distillation process.
Yeah, it's we go on these tours all the time, and sometimes I know what they're talking about, and a lot of times I'm just nodding my head yes, like acting like I know what they're talking about. So I'm super excited. Love having Tripp on. He's a friend of the show, and he's getting to test out his new equipment he paid for. So we appreciate it.
We always appreciate Barrell and being able to help support the podcast and have all this nice new equipment too. So it's perfect.
Yep, absolutely. So no, super excited about it because we are, like we've always said, we don't know shit about distilling, so we're glad to have someone here who does. So
there are people that went to school for this, so that they do know what they're talking about from time to time.
Absolutely.
So let's go ahead and introduce our guest today. So today on the show, you've heard him before in previous podcasts, but we have Tripp Stimson. He is the Master Distiller and Director of Operations at Barrell Bourbon. So Tripp, welcome back.
Thanks for having me, guys. Good to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. So Joe keeping you busy?
Always. Never a dull moment.
Mm-hmm. So we were talking earlier, talking about your goals. What's some Joe goals for the year for you guys? Coming off that big banner year of 2020, all those medals. Or 2019, I guess.
Lofty goals. We've got looking at doing the usual, probably 4 bourbon batches. We've got our Rye 3 batch that'll be coming out here soon. We actually brought that with us today. We've got some Infinite releases. We've got Dovetail. We've got, we're doing some fun things with finishes. I don't want to shine the light too much on that. We can talk about that another time, but there's some really, really interesting things coming out, coming down the line this year. So stay tuned.
Absolutely. So before we kind of dive into a lot of this stuff, I think people need to know about, your background and sort of like, I think we've talked about it before, but like, let's give folks a reintroduction of like your background and where you got into the industry and how
why are you qualified to teach us about distilling?
Like, let's go ahead. Like, where's your degree here?
I was the only one you could get to sit down.
Exactly. He's the only one to answer our calls.
Okay. So my background's in biochemistry and molecular biology. Degrees from college. I went straight from college and started work for Brown-Forman as a research and development scientist. I spent 10 years with Brown-Forman in various roles, analytical chemistry, benchtop chemistry, microbiology, doing a lot of distillery sciences and yeasting and distillery efficiencies. Left Brown-Forman, I started a consulting company that was really focused on the craft side of the business. At the time, there were people just getting into this glorified distillery business with these great dreams of if you build it, they will come kind of ideas. And I wanted to really bring a level of expertise to these people that showed that it wasn't all really a bowl of cherries. This is really what you're going to be doing.
A bowl of cherries. I've never heard that one before.
I like that. I might use that.
And lay it out there real time and say, this is your investment. This is how long you're going to wait for your return. And this is how hard you're going to work. And really put that into context before people would take the leap. So I did that for a handful of years and met Joe through that process. We began working together 6 years ago this year. And we've been working together ever since. We have a very similar view on the approach to everything, and it just works.
And he sold you on the dream of distillery.
Yeah, yeah. We're working on
Still
it.
a dream.
Yeah, we're getting there.
Still dreaming it up.
So, you have this idea of also doing distillery, but, we really kind of want to go and really pick your brain here, because as we start getting into what does the distilling process look like I said, let's kind of go a little bit, start from finish. And, I think this is really going to be focused on a lot of the bourbon nerds and the bourbon geeks out there that really want to dive in. They want to know exactly what do you have to do to make sure that there's no contamination, no bacteria, our pH levels of thing.
Sure.
When you're in the fermentation, why
is everybody's tank so special? Fermentation tank.
That's Ryan's thing. Everybody's got their special fermentation tanks, but how much gas can really come off there, and that's because you see some that have closed, you have some that are open, you have some that are outdoor, you have some that have huge vacuums on them. So I think we'll tackle some of those things there, but I guess let's start at the very beginning of the distillation process. And I would imagine it just kind of starts with grains, right?
It does. And it's always funny to me where, we always jump in and we talk about the distillation process. And to me, I always think of that as starting a movie halfway through. You've left out so much of the important stuff prior to this distillation process that really affects your distillation. So if we go all the way back to the grains and deciding what your grain bill is going to be and how we treat the grains, where does it come from? How do you mill your grains? Particle size actually plays a big part in this when you're milling your grains. If you go down to, say, a powder versus like a grist, like the beer guys would use, you will get different fermentations out of both of those.
Okay, so let's hit that part right there.
Okay.
So assuming you're using different kinds of machines to get the different, like I said, the different variable of is it a powder versus like a grist or whatever?
Sure.
Is it grist or grit?
Grist.
Grist. Okay, is this me being city slicker? I don't really know what grist means.
I don't either. So, but I heard him say grist.
Like grist mill.
Oh, okay.
You've heard grist mill before, right?
No, I don't think I have.
Okay,
for grits. No, I'm kidding.
Well, I was I like grits, and grits are basically ground up corn. So I was like, is it like that kind of size right there? Smaller than that?
Give or take. Well, it's like sand. It could be like thick sand in your hand versus, say, almost a powder.
Okay.
And what you've done, there's a handful of different mills people use: roller mills, hammer mills. You can use the cage mills, and they're all going to do a little bit different type of grind on your grain.
Is it kind of like when you do coffee, say an espresso is a real fine,
right,
grated up coffee, real dense, whereas a pour over or something is more kind of bigger grain, I guess, or
sure,
type of texture.
Well, and let's go back to what the whole goal of what we're trying to do here. We're trying to take this grain, we'll say a kernel of grain, and we're trying to make available as much of that starch as we can before we move into mashing. So ideally, you would think the finer we can grind it, the more available the starch is. So you take that and you go across all these different ways of milling, the different types of mills and how they get to that grind. So some mills and throughput are going to create heat. Well, you don't really want heat, because then you start to really denature these starches that you can't use in your fermentation to create alcohol. So there's different mills will require different throughput, and there are certain ways to use each mill so that you get the right particle size without generating the heat.
Well, I want to go even before the grinding, to the actual grain and the growing of the grains,
okay,
and the soil and the regions they come from.
Wasn't this a distilling podcast?
Well, I know. Well, you said you want to go all the way back to the grains, so it just...
All right, let's do it. Let's do it.
So because you are distilling, and removing a lot of things from the original, I guess, grain itself, does it matter, which region it comes from or which type of soil or type of grain it is? From corn to corn, not saying corn to wheat or corn, but
sure,
from different varieties of within that species.
Yeah, absolutely. And even go a step further, and every year, annually, if we have a lot of rain, you're going to get a different grain than you got the year before. And, one test that many distilleries will do is they'll look for aflatoxin. So if you have a really rainy season, you're going to get some molds out there, and aflatoxin, being a byproduct from mold, can show up in the corn that's delivered to your distillery. So aflatoxin actually will fluoresce under a UV light. So if you take a thing of grain and you put a UV light over it, you see specks of fluoresced grain, aflatoxin. And then if there's any aflatoxin, you won't accept it. Yeah.
Do you know that, Ryan? Do you know what aflatoxin was?
I didn't, but it does sound like a mold or a fungus. I know what fluorescence and like inflorescent, and
glow in the dark
bacteria is
posters.
kind of starting to inoculate themselves and stuff.
It's like a fish poster at this point. All right. So at this point, we're now milling the grains and stuff like that. We talked about the size of it. I guess let's kind of go on to the next portion of this.
Okay, so we've got our grain the size we want. Now we're going to move into mashing. You're going to use warm water to further break down that grain to make the starch available. So in this process, you're going to either have a malted grain that's going to provide the enzyme, or you're going to add an exogenous enzyme that you've bought from a company who's isolated and concentrated this enzyme that you're going to add at the same time. Either way you do it, the goal is the same. You want to take these large, long-chain carbohydrates and cut them down into small 3-carbon sugars. Anything over a 3-carbon sugar, the yeast can't do anything with. So these enzymes are going to cleave these long-chain molecules into these smaller chain molecules during this process to prepare for the actual fermentation process. So
these big mash tubs that we usually see when we go through, I know we've seen them at Heaven Hill, we've seen them in a few different places. I mean, is there a size that these things usually end up being, like as a recommended size, or can it be as small as like a child's swimming pool versus something that's a huge tank?
I mean, the science will remain the same no matter what size you use. The enzymes are going to work at the same temperatures, but the mash tub is typically sized with the size of your process. So you're not going to have a big monster still in a small mash tub. Mm-hmm. And inversely, you're not going to have a huge mash tub and a real small still.
Now with yeast, because they, I guess, multiply and stuff, like,
the yeast isn't added yet though, right?
No, yeah, we're not there yet.
Not there yet.
Okay.
Don't jump ahead.
Back up.
Don't jump ahead. Because I got another question here, which is, you said about adding warm water. Now, I know when I go to these things and you touch them, like they're hot to the hand.
Yeah.
Like when you say warm water, it's not like bath warm, right? I mean, you're adding some, I would say, some scalding hot water to it or something like that, or it's heating up. Like what's going on in there?
So I say warm water because at this point you've likely recycled warm water off of something else. So you've taken cold water, probably through a condenser or something, taken that heat, you recycle that heat into another process. So in this, let's just say it's into the cooker. So you're taking the warm water off something else into the cooker with these grains while adding steam. Either your direct injection or you're jacketed, or maybe you have tubes in your cooker. Either way, you're adding heat somehow, and you're really on your way to almost a boil. And then you're going to add these grains at different times for different reasons, and these different enzymes are actually going to work at different temperatures. So you've got to be careful, because if your enzymes are in and you go above a certain temperature, then those enzymes are going to denature. They're not going to work. Mm-hmm. So you're not going to get your conversion.
So if you have like a 500 gallon, say, whatever mash cooker, is there like a certain percentage of, the mash to water that or like, what is that percentage, I guess? You can run a thin beer, what we call a thin beer or a thick beer, or anything in between the two. You don't want to go too thick, because then your yeast isn't going to work. It's going to be too thick. There's going to be too much pressure. The yeast isn't going to be active. If you go the other way and you go real thin, the yeast is going to perform well, but now you've used all this energy up to that point to have a fermentation, but you could have actually had some more grain in there, so you're getting more bang for your buck, let's say. So the trick is to find out, how thick can I go, maximize the alcohol from the fermentation without going so thick that it starts to suppress the yeast. Gotcha.
And so I guess another question with just the mash tubs in general and the cookers, I think the ones that I've seen, usually, I mean, inside of it looks like a KitchenAid mixer.
Yeah,
right. I mean,
absolutely.
they're sitting there spinning everything around and trying to keep that going. Like, is that normal industry standard that you have that, or is there sometimes there's somebody with a broom, an end of a broom handle, and they're trying to just like mix it around or something?
A canoe paddle.
Canoe paddle. There you go.
That's how we mix up our stuff.
I've seen it done about every which way you can imagine. The canoe paddle is definitely a thing. It does happen. On your larger scale distilleries, though, you're going to have a nice agitator. The tubes on the inside or the coils are going to be for your steam, either coils or jacket. You can go either way. But yeah, that's pretty much an industry standard.
So how long does a typical process like this usually go when you're trying to mash it and you're trying to basically add water to the grain to start basically making them change their molecules? I don't really know if that's the right word I'm looking here for, but try and change their properties a little bit.
It's going to depend on how much you're trying to do at one time. So let's say, let's operate off, say, 1,000-gallon working capacity. You're gonna go in, you're gonna add your corn, your hot water, you're gonna go to a boil, you're gonna cook for 30 minutes, 45 minutes, whatever, wherever you land in your profile. Then you're going to start to cool down, put some rye in there, and you're going to cool a little more. And then that's where your enzymes start to work. You've got your alpha and your beta amylase enzymes that work at the 155 and the 135 degree ranges. So that's really where you're going to start to get a whole bunch of your conversion, is right there where the enzymes are working. And then you can hold it there for another 20 minutes, 30 minutes. Again, this is going to be a little bit of trial and error depending on your facility, but you're probably looking at 2.5 to 3.5 hours probably for a full mashing cooking session before you go into your fermenter.
And how do you know it's like ready?
Well, that's the trial and error part. You start with a basic profile, and at the end, you see if there are things left on the table. You take measurements of a bunch of different stuff through your fermentation, and we can talk about this later, that actually will measure. It will actually give you ideas of your starch conversion, the fermentation, how much sugar's left over, which there shouldn't be any, right? So if there is, you've had problems with yeast or some other variable, you measure all these things and you come up with the most efficient profile.
What if you didn't have any instruments, like back in the day? You're just like,
and you just in the woods.
Yeah, exactly.
Just dip your finger in it and taste it. Like, can you tell from that? Or is there
you can. If you were to take just a basic mash early on, right before you start your fermentation and you taste it, it will be sweet. It will have sugar sweet properties to it. At the end of your fermentation, when you taste it, it's going to be sour. So once you taste the difference in the two, then you know on the front side what you're looking for.
So another question that I had about looking at the grains that are going into, you had mentioned at first, like you add in things a little bit later, like you add in the rye later, it's like, so is it because corn has a different property and that's why you add it in first, or do you add in rye first? Like which grain do you choose first because of just the chemical nature or compound of it?
The corn traditionally is the hardest to get to based on its physical structure, the kernel itself. Breaking all of that down and actually getting to the available starch is the most difficult in corn. That's why you boil the crap out of the corn first. Then everything else is at cooler temperatures. So you work your way to the top and then back down. Rye, you really don't want to cook rye too much. And then the malted barley, the barley is traditionally just for the enzyme at the low percentage. Now, as you increase that percentage, you can get some good flavoring from it. But malted barley traditionally is for the enzymes.
What about any other like malted grains that you put in there? Like, does that affect the time that you come in? Because I know if you malt something beforehand, it's probably going to affect what you're going to be doing in the mashing process.
Absolutely. And you can malt just about anything you want to, and you're going to get some enzymatic capability out of that malted grain. The enzymes are still going to work in the same temperature range. So even if you decide you want to malt corn, you can't go up and boil that corn and just because it's malted corn, come back down and the enzyme is going to work. You still denature the enzyme once you go above that temperature.
So, all right. So I think we've kind of got this part now.
We're ready to go to have some yeast, right?
Well, I think at this point, it usually leaves the cooker, right? And you have some sort of vacuum or tubing or something that gets it to a fermentation tank, correct?
That's correct.
And so kind of talk about, I mean, because you've been in this process before, like what does it look like to build a system that is either like vacuum sucking, whatever it is, to actually pumping, moving all this stuff from, not probably vacuuming sucking. It's probably,
they don't have a Dyson hooked up. They got a water pump.
Very, very powerful Dyson. Yeah. But kind of talk about some of those things that maybe people don't see.
So, let's start with the most efficient way on a large scale. You're going to have some nice stainless steel pipe. You're going to have a really nice pump. And when it's time to go from the cooker to the fermenter, you're going to push a button on your switchboard and it's going to open a valve. Your pump's going to kick on and you're going to empty the cooker into the fermenter.
How many gallons per minute? Let's talk my love language. I love it.
It depends. There's a piece of your process that this fits into. You've cooked for so much time. Now it's going to take you, if you've got a pump that runs 25 gallons a minute, you've got a 100-gallon tank, it's going to go a lot quicker than if you have a 10,000-gallon tank and a 25-gallon minute pump.
Sure.
So you size everything so that it takes the right amount of time to move the mash from the cooker to the fermenter. And that will change whether you're running 100 gallons or 100,000 gallons. So again, that's engineering, but you basically work it into your process. And then on the other side, on the craft side, it can be anything. I mean, it can be pull it out and, drain it into a bucket, take the bucket, dump it into the fermenter. It can be hook a hose to a smaller pump and run a hose across the floor to a fermenter. Any way that you can, with some sort of good sanitary practice, get the cooked mash from the cooker over to the fermenter. I mean, whatever makes sense, you can do it 100 different ways.
So from anybody that's never visited a distillery or know what these look like, why couldn't you have a cooker and a fermenter do the same exact thing?
You can. So if you wanted to do one fermentation a week, you could have a cooker, or even distillation. Let's do the whole thing. You could actually have a pot still that you could cook your grains in, ferment in, and then also distill from. The problem with that is that you've now occupied one space to do all three things. The idea around having typically one cooker and 3 to 4 fermenters is that you can set it up so you're doing something every day.
Yeah. You're not waiting on it to finish all three.
Exactly.
Yep.
Exactly.
I got you. So the other kind of question about this is like, when I know that we've had the opportunity to go to a distillery and, you can put your hands in the mash and everything like that, but give folks that are listening kind of understanding of like when something is actually going from the cooker to the fermentation tank, like, is it just like water at this point, or is it basically like water with a few crumbles? Like kind of talk about the consistency of what this product is at this point.
It's, again, if you're trying to run a thicker beer, it's going to be just a little bit thinner than oatmeal. And if you're running a really thin beer, it's going to be cloudy water. I mean, it'll look like really muddy water, I guess, consistency wise.
And are you usually trying to like hit the middle ground with both these spectrums right here? Is that kind of what most people are trying to hit?
Yeah, it's trying to, for your facility, trying to maximize the yeast performance as well as the grain throughput so that you're not sacrificing alcohol, so that you're not leaving alcohol on the table.
All right.
You neither want to be a Miller Lite or a stout. You want to be like in the middle of those.
Somewhere in the middle. Somewhere in the middle there.
Yeah.
So all right. So now we got to the point that we've got our product going into the fermentation tank, right?
That's right.
And we've seen it. Usually there's a pipe that somebody moves and it's draining into there. Sometimes it actually drains. Sometimes like from bottom up. Sometimes like it can be pumped in there. See, I said it right. Pumped in there.
Yep.
So at this point, when it starts filling up, talk us through the process.
Well, let's talk about yeast for just a second, and then we'll
been waiting.
Yeah. So there's a few different ways you can go about using yeast in your fermentation process. The most frequently used, and easiest to use is going to be a dried yeast. So you order a dried yeast in known quantities from a manufacturer. They tell you how much yeast to use for whatever product you're making. They'll even give you a few little flavor notes that yeast is going to create. You take that in the recommended quantities, and while this fermenter is filling up, you take the yeast and you throw it in. done. That's it.
How many different varieties of yeast are there for, say, like bourbon production?
Oh my
Like
goodness. I mean,
thousands or?
yeah, it could be.
Could be.
I mean,
Yeah.
it's, again, we're talking about natural species. So you can have one and it can mutate while we're sitting here having this conversation. Not really that quickly, but pretty close.
Throw Ryan into a mash tub. I'm sure it'll happen.
Yeah.
But
It'll mutate right away.
there are a lot out there, but oddly enough, there are fewer than you would expect available for folks like you and me who are, if we were to buy from somebody.
That's why you got some guys in Danville that specialize
Exactly.
in it, right?
Farm
Exactly.
Solutions.
Yeah. So there's another question. This one came from one of the Patreon communities, because we knew going into this that it would be tough to ask a lot of hard questions. So we kind of reached out to them. And so Richard Hunter asked, during the mash rest, is there a temperature there that affects the final profile that actually goes into potentially the final product? Or is like basically, do you wait for that mash to like come to almost like a lukewarm state before you start actually pushing it or pumping it into a fermenter?
So it's a good question. Let's assume for a minute that when we talk about I'm not exactly sure the context in which he's referring to a mash rest, but in my experience, I have done what we'll call a mash rest in certain types of rye fermentations. And the idea behind that is during that rest period, it actually gives the enzymes time to continue to break down starches. And that's really what that rest, or starches, or in the rye case, proteins. That's really what that rest is allowing time for. And I'm assuming that's what he was asking. And if not, I'm happy to come back and revisit the question.
Yeah. No, we'll get there.
That's close enough.
Yeah. All right. So we're in the fermentation tanks. You've added the yeast. At this point, we've got, this is where a lot of the magic happens, right? You got the bubble starting to form. You got that crust layer building on top. Now, what is the chemical breakdown that's actually happening that we're watching at this point?
Basically, what you're looking at is starch molecules being converted into alcohol and CO2 on the very base level. That's what's going on. So the alcohol is created, the CO2 bubbles off, and that's what you're seeing. That's why it looks like it's boiling, even though it's not.
And then I know that we've been to some distilleries, and when you're watching the boil, sometimes there's like, it almost looks like red, almost like there's blood in the water. Like, is that just like fats and oils from corn?
Yeah, it's oils from corn. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well,
And it's like hypnotic. I always look at that. I'm like, oh, am I on something? It's like, it's like, just takes your breath away. I don't know. And too, like if you put your head down, it's like you almost lose your breath sometimes.
Yeah, I wouldn't recommend doing that because that can be pretty dangerous, especially to fermenters that are closed.
That's what's wrong with me.
You walk by and open that door and you get a face full of CO2. It can knock you out.
Yeah.
So kind of talk about the idea of why somebody would do a closed fermentation versus an open fermentation, and why you see some that have, you see some that have almost like the submarine doors on them, like the submarine windows, and then you see some that just have huge vent hoods on top of them too.
So this is the age-old argument that will never be solved about why we do open top fermentation versus a closed top fermentation. And we can get into cypress and stainless sometime too as well. But when you look at an open top fermentation, the idea that some people have is that it's a sanitation issue. So a lot of people will use a closed top fermenter for that reason. So I'll back up and say that if you condition your yeast properly, and this is not necessarily the box yeast, but if you condition yeast properly prior to adding it to your fermentation.
What do you mean by condition? Like push-ups or pull-ups? Like sprints? Or what do you...
Yes. Basically, it's a yeast training program prior to the fermentation.
All right, yeast, get your butts out there.
And as funny as that is, that's really what you're doing is you're putting the yeast in the environment similar to what it's going to see in the fermentation. So yeah, it's basically like training for a marathon is what I like to say.
CrossFit for yeast.
Exactly.
Yeah. So how do you said, there's like thousands and thousands and they're living things. Like how do you prevent from those thousands and thousands of variables from taking over that particular yeast? Is it like you have so much of that particular yeast that it's dominant and can outcompete other yeast strains, or how does one bad apple not get in there and start taking over?
So up until you start your fermentation, everything is pretty much, we'll say, sanitized. You basically boiled the grain. Everything is clean up until it goes into the fermenter. So at that point, you have basically allowed the environment to interact with your clean mash. So that's when potential bacteria can set in, potential molds, stuff that's in the air that you don't see, but that we all know is there. That's when it starts to interact with your mash. Now, if you have a strong yeast strain that has been conditioned properly, it's going to outcompete any of those naturally occurring microorganisms in the fermentation so that you don't have to worry about something else taking over. Also, as soon as that yeast starts working, if you can time that properly to where you add your yeast as your fermenter's filling up, that yeast is going to start to create CO2 and create an anaerobic environment, which is an environment that's lacking oxygen, which means those bacteria and mold spores are not going to grow.
Gotcha. That makes sense.
Yep. And so this is where the magic is happening. So this is also, you know, when we go and we visit these things and you see these fermentation tanks, I think we'll get into the steel versus Cypress in a minute. But one question that I've always had is like, sometimes they're like, oh, we do 3 or 4 days. Some people are like, oh, we're 6-7 day. What's the determining factor there to say like, oh, it's going to take this many days, or like, oh, we let it go for 10? Like, does that really matter at the end of the day?
So yes and no. A lot of it, again, is going to be yeast strain. A lot of it's going to be how thick a beer you run, how much starch is actually in that, how much is available in that fermentation for conversion. If you run a thinner beer and say you don't temperature control your fermentation and you go from, say, a 70-ish set point and it skyrockets into the 90s, that yeast is going to roll through every available amount of starch in that fermentation very quickly. So you're going to get a large majority of your alcohol in that first 12 to 24 hours. And then depending on how well your enzymes work, you get your secondary fermentation, and that's what the additional days are for. If you run a thicker beer and there's physically more starch in there that's available to convert, and you want to control your temperatures in your fermentations through chill water, more coils in the fermenters, then you can actually take longer to convert all of those starches. And basically what that does is allow you to make up for, say, weekends or holidays or things like that. You control the temperature, which drags it out longer. And you run a thicker beer, so there's more starch in there. So the process just physically takes longer.
It's not like barbecuing low and slow isn't necessarily better.
Not necessarily in this case.
So like a rye whiskey versus a bourbon or a American malt or whatever, does each grain have different fermentation days, I guess, required for them?
Again, it goes back to starch content.
Yeah.
I mean, the fermentation times are really going to be determined by, thickness of your beer, the type of yeast strain you're using, and whether or not you want to control the temperatures of your fermentation.
People always talk about like rye. They're like, oh, rye is such a pain in the ass because it gums up everything. Is it like a thicker beer, or is it?
So traditionally, rye is going to have a whole lot of protein by comparison. It has a lot more protein than you're going to see in any of these other grains. And for that reason, you get the foam. I mean, people talk about gumming stuff up and foam, and it's protein. So, if you eliminate that protein, then you can eliminate the problems with rye fermentations.
So when you do rye, are you like, all right, I get my A-list yeast over there can do the most burpees and the most push-ups to take this on because it's going to be a bitch?
There are yeast strains that are going to perform better in a rye than others.
Okay.
But also you still got to take care of that protein. I mean, that's really what's going on is that protein. If you've ever seen a rye fermentation go awry, see what I did there?
No pun intended.
Yeah. It will, it almost balloons out the top in a lot of cases. And what that's doing is that protein's actually holding all that CO2 in there. So now you're starting to suppress the performance of the yeast. And if you do that, it's just going to gradually slow your fermentation until it stops. And when you stop prematurely, you've left all that converted starch on the table. So now instead of getting, say, a 7 or 8% beer, 9% beer, you're getting 1 to 2, 3% beer because your fermentation didn't go all the way to completion.
So go get that paddle, start stirring it up.
Or do you have to scrap it?
Well, a rule of thumb is you never scrap it.
Gotcha.
You got to figure out a way to make it work. One of the things that Joe always refers to is, when we first met, he asked me, "What do you do when it goes wrong?" And I just rolled off the cuff. Well, it never goes wrong. and
He probably loved that answer.
He did, and he still tells that story. And at the time, I didn't really understand why I said what I said, but what I'm saying when I say that is that you have to be ready for these things. You have to understand what's going on so that when your rye fermentation goes awry, you have some protocol in place to say, okay, we're sitting here looking, the proteins are thicker in this particular fermentation than usual. We need to make a corrective action. And just knowing what to do to combat each of those problems that comes along, then it's expected. It's not if something goes wrong, it's when something goes wrong.
Right.
And if you operate with that mindset, then you're just prepared.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we're still in the fermentation process here. And I think we skipped a step because there's one thing that we always talk about, and that's the sweet versus sour mash, right? I mean, this is where this all happens in this stage too, correct?
That's right.
So kind of give folks an idea of when we say something is sour mash, what does that mean? What do you get if you mix Seattle craft, Texas heritage, and Scottish know-how? That's 2 Bar Spirits. 2 Bar Spirits traces its roots to a ranch in rural Texas run by the founder, Nathan Kaiser's family for 6 generations. Nathan grew up on the ranch with stories of relatives bootlegging moonshine. And after moving into Seattle, he wanted to keep the family tradition alive, and he opened 2 Bar Spirits in 2012. They're a very traditional distillery, making everything from scratch, and each day starts by milling 1,000 pounds of grain. Their entire product lineup consists of only 2 whiskeys, their moonshine and the only bourbon made in Seattle. Both bottles are being featured in Rack House Whiskey Club's next box. Rack House Whiskey Club is a Whiskey of the Month club, and they're on a mission to uncover the best flavors and stories that craft distilleries across the U.S. have to offer. Rack House ships out 2 of the featured distillery's finest bottles, along with some cool merchandise in a box delivered to your door every 2 months. Go to rackhousewhiskeyclub.com to check it out and try some 2 Bar for yourself. Use code PURSUIT for $25 off your first box. So kind of give folks an idea of when we say something is sour mash, what does that mean?
So a sour mash is when you take your mash, and as you're either in your cooker or on the way to the fermenter, you're adjusting the pH. And the reason for a quote unquote sour mash is because yeast strains will often work better at a lower pH. So your pH is going to be a little bit different depending on where you are in the world. Our water is, it's never 7, right? It's never going to be neutral. You're in the
More basic here, right?
Is that the magic number of 7?
Well, 7's neutral.
7's neutral.
See,
And then you have acidic or basic. Would you go Trinity? What the heck? You need your money back.
Can you be quiet for just a few minutes? We're going to let Ryan take over from here.
Yeah.
So, your rye is going to be probably a little less than 7. Actually, you're probably going to be in the mid 6s, mid to upper 6s. And to go from that down to, say, the mid 4s, that's the souring process. Now, when people say sweet mash, that's when you just put the mash in the fermenter and roll with it. So you're sitting at probably a 6.5, 6.8 pH, and you just slowly allow it to naturally sour. And that's another interesting point, is that even though you set a sweet mash, it sours too. You're everything is souring the whole time. By the time you're done, both a sweet mash and a sour mash have finished at a 3.5 to a 4 pH, let's say.
So why do people make a big thing of saying we only do sweet mash?
In my opinion, I prefer to do the sour mash only because what you're doing is you're creating the environment geared for the yeast strain that you're using so that you get the best performance. When you use a sweet mash, you are just creating a we'll say just a random fermentation, and you're throwing a yeast strain in. So it's
More
not
variables.
Exactly. Well, it's not conditioned to that particular. It's like a tailored suit versus a suit you buy off the shelf. The tailored suit's going to be custom tailored to you. It's going to fit perfect. Whereas another suit, well, it'll get the job done, but it's not perfect.
You got high waters or
MC Hammer pants.
Yeah. So you bring up an interesting about pH. So like, say you're in a different part of the country, like where water is, say, like a lower pH. You're out west where you got a lot of, trying to think of the word. Anyways, the water is more acidic or something. I guess is there buffering systems put in place to kind of straighten that out before it goes in, or will the yeast and everything kind of it'll bring it to that point?
It will work, and I've not run into a situation where the water is too acidic. Typically, what you're doing is you're adding either backset or some sort of acid, phosphoric acid, or something to bring that pH down. Usually, you're going to start up close to 7, no matter where you are. That's
what I meant. It's higher. Yes.
Yeah.
Higher.
I got you.
Yep.
It's going to vary between that 6.5 and 7, no matter where you are, but the direction from there is always going to be down.
Gotcha.
And so there's another question that came in from David Glassman on Patreon, and he kind of asked about, we talked about basically the sour mashing process, and is the end, and I'm going to try to like adapt his question a little bit, and then there's one more after his. Is the flavor more consistent when you go through a sour mash process versus sweet mash, which could just be like, we're going to flip a quarter this time and see what happens?
There are a lot of variables that go into producing something consistently. And in order to create a finished product that is exactly the same day in and day out, then you want to be able to replicate everything the exact same way, exact best you can upstream. So starting with grain all the way through, if there's something you can do to control an aspect of a process or measure to better control the aspect of a process, in my opinion, you should do that. So if we're talking about the flavor in the finished product, does a sour mash or a sweet mash, make the most sense or have an effect? I'm going to say that the sour mash is going to be the best way to control the variables that are going to affect your finished product.
Do you think you got that philosophy from working like somebody like Brown Foreman, where you're like, don't screw it up, or keep it? It's like, we don't want any variables. But say you're like just starting, your own, thing. What would you still would do the same thing?
Yeah, I think I would. Only so many people don't know. The idea is that you take some medium, some grain, starch, corn, sugar, water, whatever, you throw it all in a fermenter or a bucket or whatever you're using. You throw some yeast in there, and magically you get this wonderful product. And you will get alcohol, you will get some sort of flavor. But what if you make the greatest stuff in the world and you have no idea how you did it?
Right.
So if you've got to meter yourself as you go through these things, and by really measuring each of these steps and controlling as much as you can in the process, you have a much better chance of reproducing the exact same thing at the end of the day versus leaving too much up to chance.
And so another question and this is really where David Glassman's question really comes in, is that, so say that you are done mashing or you're done doing bourbon for 3 months and you want to do a run of rye. Now, do you use a bourbon backset into a rye mash or vice versa? Or do you like hold some back for the bourbon to like do that consistency? Or does having a rye backset, could that affect the flavor of what the eventual bourbon will be?
Sure. Again, that's going to be up to the individual. Do you want to do that? Will it work? Yeah, sure it'll work. Is it going to affect the flavor? Yeah. But it's still going to provide, biomass for your yeast cells. It's still going to adjust the pH like you wanted it to. But it'll affect the taste. I mean, you're taking a bourbon backset and you're putting it into a rye mash. You're adding other flavors.
So, like, say you come off summer shutdown, okay, and you haven't distilled in 3 weeks, and there's no backset there. So, do you go make a batch and then just to be backset, or what? How do you do that when you've shut down for like 3 weeks or something?
Most folks will just run a sweet mash and start over.
Gotcha.
And a lot of times if your backset is too low, pH is too low, if it's too acidic, then you won't use it at all anyway. You just run a sweet mash. But on small scales, you can actually buy acids to adjust the pH. Once you get up into 95,000 gallon fermenters, it doesn't make sense to go out and buy a whole bunch of acid to adjust your pH.
Right.
Sounds
like one hell of a trip.
Yeah. so you try to utilize what would be a waste product and use that for benefit.
We're 5, 6, 7 days into the fermentation. Now it's time to get it over to the still, right? So kind of talk about what that looks like. How do you get rid of the leftover waste and all that sort of stuff too?
So once your fermentation is complete, and ideally when I say complete, you're moving the fermenter to the still as the very last molecule of alcohol is being made. And no, you can't really measure that, but as far as the molecular process, that would be the most advantageous way to do it. So you're moving it into the still, and let's start. We'll start with we do pot still first.
Sure.
There's a lot of different ones, but say you're moving your fermenter to your pot still. You seal up your pot still. You turn on your steam or your direct fire or however you're heating this pot. And in a pot still, you basically have to boil what's in the pot to drive off the different compounds to go through your column or through the helm of the line arm, however you're set up, whether you're a traditional pot or you're a pot column hybrid. The science of what's going on is still going to be the same. You're heating up what's in the pot itself in order to separate the things that you want from the things that you don't.
So we know that vapors are starting to go up, right? And that's your first.
Why? I want to know why. Sorry.
Go ahead.
What is the design of the pot for? Like what is, I guess, why did they make it those shapes, like those big teardrop shapes?
Yeah, great question. That's a great question. I think some of it is probably just because it looks nice, but some of it too, like the alembic stills have that real pretty helmet style on it. What that does, it's almost a form of reflux. So the vapors go into a big space, and the heavier stuff falls to the wayside, catches the sides of that, and rolls back down, and has to be heated again to make it through the big space back into a smaller space to then go on to the condenser. You have to be the right size.
Gotcha.
You have to be light enough to where you pass right through the opening versus hitting the side, sticking and sliding back down. I guess if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does make sense.
And we're taking everything out of the fermentation tank and putting it into the still, correct? Like even like those 2 inches of cake that you see on the top of the fermentation tank too?
You can do it one of two ways. You can move the whole thing over and do what they call distilling on grain, which is all the grains are in there. Or you can actually take it, pull the grains out, and you use the cake for something else and just put liquid in there.
So like basically you're running it through a coffee filter at that point, something like that.
Coffee filter or
cheesecloth,
some kind of press.
Yeah. I think a coffee filter might be a little too much. I think probably just
really big coffee filter.
A nice little fine mesh strainer.
Keurig cup.
So we're here, we're heating everything up, and now we have basically our first vapors are coming up. And then from there, they usually travel through another pipe, and they go down through what you said, a condenser or a doubler, correct?
Yeah. So you can set it up where it has a doubler, and you'll go from the pot still through the helmet, through the line arm, down into a doubler, which is you basically you don't really double the proof, but you do go up, we'll say 15-20%. You're going to increase the proof of what originally came off the still. Then it's going to go from the doubler to the condenser, where it comes in contact with a cool shell and tube heat exchanger typically is what's used, and that vapor is going to cool down, run down the sides of the condenser and out as a liquid.
What is the doubler doing to get those 15 proof points higher? What's going on in that doubler?
So
they always say doubler, like I don't know. That's
or thumper.
Yeah.
If you've ever heard it. If you've ever been next to one of those things, one of those thumpers while it's running, you hear it, it's going thump, 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 thump. And what's happening is the vapor is actually breaking the surface tension of the water coming back up and re-vaporizing itself to move on to the condenser. And as it does that, that water it's almost like it's not really a filtration, but it's pulling impurities out of that alcohol and then further concentrating the ethanol itself, so that once it does hit the condenser, it has gone up in proof a little bit.
Great.
Gotcha. Makes sense.
And so this is, now we're at the what's called the tail box, right? And people start seeing that, you have the ability to kind of see that white liquid start flowing through. But this is another question that comes from Jim Eaton, and he wants to know, and I don't really know how this works on a large scale, but how do you know when you have the heads, hearts, and the tails? And also try to make sure we explain that to our listeners, what that nomenclature actually means.
Okay, so traditionally the heads, hearts, and tails cuts are the three parts of the distillation. The first part being the heads, which is going to be methanol, a small, very small portion is going to be methanol and some other items that you don't really want. The hearts being the center of the distillation is what you're actually looking for. It's what you want to keep. The tails are going to be some, it's the very end, the real oily material that's left after you've pulled everything out that you want. So the heads, first of all, in a pot still, as you're heating things up, you've got thermometers, hopefully, in your pot and toward the top of your column, so that just before you either go to your doubler or your condenser, you can monitor the temperature. That temperature is going to tell you what items are coming over at that point in time. All of these things, you're basically separating based on physical weight properties of each of these compounds. The lighter stuff obviously is going to come off first. The heavier stuff, it's going to take longer to heat up because it's heavier and you got to heat it up more and push it up further. So the methanol is going to come off first. And so if you hover around, it's like 164, 165, somewhere in there, hover around that temperature. Once that temperature goes up a little bit further, methanol's gone. And you can actually let that go out the vent. You don't even have to take the heads cut. You can condense it and then dispose of it, or you can just let it go out the vent and then start condensing around your 172, 173, where you're starting to get into the beginning of what will be your hearts cut, which is where the ethanol starts to come off.
Okay, so that makes sense. So now that I know that there's like some temperature, some instruments here, it's not like, shit, Jerry, sorry, it's your day, man. Go in there and taste it. Make sure we're in the hearts.
Make sure that's the head cut.
Yeah.
You taste that methanol?
And I mean, I guess also explain some of the health risks that are involved with it too, because I think that's one thing that many people don't understand is that, you can find moonshine from everywhere, but if you're not getting the right type of stuff, that, apparently can make you go blind or something like that.
Yeah, methanol or wood alcohol it's sometimes referred to. In large concentrations, it can affect the optic nerve and it can make you go blind. I think it takes quite a bit to do that. It's, we're talking real small, from pot still size fermentations. We're talking pretty small amounts of methanol. And
during your training, did you have to actually taste a heads or a tails to be like, oh, this all right, now I know what it tastes like?
Well, you can. It's very similar to acetone. It's very acetone note, so it's very distinctive, and it's got a sweet, almost a sweet note to it as well. So once you pass from heads to hearts, it's pretty distinctive. I mean, you know it.
Mm-hmm. And then also, like with the heads and the tails, I've heard that I maybe you said it already, but you can basically just run that through the still again.
So you can. Again, the heads, if you make a pretty precise heads cut, you either won't have it or will dispose of that. There's no reason to run that through the still again because you don't want anything there anyway. The tails, you can run that back through the still again and try to further concentrate some of the alcohols that are in there and some of the flavor compounds and separate them from the larger molecules, the oils and things that you don't necessarily want. However, at some point, you're going to have to dispose of that. Because if you keep taking, 20% tails and putting it back in, all of a sudden you're not going to have room for your initial batch volume. So at some point you've got to just say, okay, we've gotten everything we want out of this, and it's got to be disposed.
Absolutely. And so I guess, we kind of talked about methanol being the head side of it. At what point, and also that's the temperature wise, but at what point do you know the tails is actually starting to hit?
That's going to vary a lot depending on, I say a lot. It's going to vary a fair amount depending on the grains that you use. So the different grains, the different yeast strains, fermentation profiles, all the things upstream, like we talked about before, are going to have an effect on the actual flavors or chemical compounds that are produced. And those chemical compounds are going to vary the temperatures that you're looking at between your heart's cut and your tail's cut. So really it's going to be driven by somebody's going to have to stand there, taste, nose, and make a judgment call. And once you've done that, and we assume that everything upstream is done the exact same all the way to that point every time, that tail's cut becomes pretty much a hard cut. Now, as things begin to vary, you might have to spend a little time looking at that tail's cut in order to make sure you're cutting it in the right place.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
So now we know the pot still side of things. Like, so let's look at the column, right? Because you say you're like steaming or heating at the bottom of a pot still, but
Sounds like a column's a lot easier.
that's what it does. I mean, that's why a lot of the big boys do it, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's because it's probably more efficient and
It is
more consistent. So kind of talk about that.
So with a column still, you have a beer feed tank that basically pumps beer into the top of the column, well, about 2/3 of the way up, just below the rectification section. And you're going to pump beer in there at a preset volume. So if it's 10 gallons a minute, 20 gallons a minute, whatever it is, each still is set up for about that flow rate. And you can't really change that a whole lot. They're set up for that. They're optimized at that flow rate. So what happens is, as that beer goes into the column and drips down, floods those trays, you have steam shooting up from the bottom. And as that steam comes up from the bottom, it basically pulls the compounds out of what's falling. So it just carries it on up. And you'll go through all the sieve trays up to the rectification area where you have your bubble caps, the bubble trays that are traditionally going to be copper. Those bubble trays, if you've ever looked at them, they look like little mushrooms, and there's holes in the mushroom, and it goes up and it follows the contour of the mushroom, goes around, and then goes up to the next one. So the idea behind that is that the larger, more cumbersome molecules will actually get caught on the sides of the copper and fall back down the next tray. Or if you make it all the way through the bubble cap and hit somewhere else in that layer, you're going to drip back down, hit the tray. And then there's also downcomers that are basically little pipes that come off the bottom of the tray, that if the tray gets too full with liquid, it's going to overflow and fall down to the next one. So in order to get back up to that tray, you have to re-vaporize and go to the next tray. And this is going over and over and over. And the whole idea around this is to separate those molecules so that you can further control not only what you get, but how much of everything you get.
They're like gatekeepers. They're like, you got to stay down there until you're ready. Like, you ain't getting through this still in some sort of way.
Okay, we'll go with that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, and at that point, it's following the same exact process, right? I mean, it's usually it's coming in, like you said before, it's doing the elbow pipe down to the doubler and then to the condenser and then through the tail box,
yeah.
Right? So pretty much the same process, just depends on how you're actually steaming away or heating up these grains at the end of the day.
That's right.
All right. And then so now that you're doing all this, the one thing that I've always wondered, we always talk about like, oh yeah, the backside goes to the pigs, or sorry, the waste goes to the pigs or whatever. But when do you actually like get the waste out of there? Like it's, you just said there, you're running this through a column still 10 to 20 gallons a minute, and it's usually continuously running, sometimes 24 hours a day. Mm-hmm. So where does the waste go?
So with a column still, once that whatever has stripped from the beer goes up, goes to your finished product. The stuff that is left over goes down, and it goes all the way down to the bottom of the still, and it gets pumped out into a slop tank. In some cases, they'll actually separate. They'll do thin stillage and thick stillage. But either way, it goes out the bottom of the still and then can either be separated or go into a tank. With a pot still, once it's done, you turn everything off. You have to take the time to pump out the pot into some stillage tank, some slop tank.
So is there still nutritional value in that, or it's not just all stripped out through the distilling process with with those grains?
It's very protein rich. Yeah, that's why you see farmers lining up by the dozens to take this stuff. I mean, I actually actually own cows myself and feed them slop, because the slop's got, in a lot of cases, 23 or so % protein in it.
Oh, wow.
Oh, yeah. And they put on some quick weight.
There you go.
Much quicker than grass.
As I say, better than the grilled cheese sandwiches I'm eating all the time. So.
Yeah.
Now, another question is proof coming off the still. Like, how do you figure out like what the variable, or how do you control what's coming off? Because, for being a bourbon, you can't come off more than 160. And I know that a lot of people out there, they're like, oh, like we do 125, we do 130. Like, how do you control the proof that's actually coming off of there?
So with the pot still, as your still's running, you're coming off based on your weights again, and ethanol and on down the line. And you're going to start coming off at 160 or whatever, 165. It's going to be real high. But then what happens is, as you bring everything else over, the finished product, whatever is finished in that tank at the end of your run, is going to be 125 or 135 proof, whatever it is. You control how much you want to let through via deflator, which is basically like a condenser before the condenser, except the stuff that you don't want at that point flows back into a tray in the top of the column and basically gets revaporized again. The column still is very similar. You have a deflator up at the top that says nothing over, we'll say 191 degrees can go by. So there's enough cooling water in there to hold that temperature at 191. Anything that vaporizes at a temperature higher than that goes back down. Anything that vaporizes up to that temperature can go through.
There we go. Problem solved. Now I figured out. Now I know what the hell's going on there.
Yep.
And so I guess, there's another question that, before we I guess at this point we've distilled, and now we just put this shit in a barrel, right? And we wait, right? I mean, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, you decide at what
entry proof, you got to decide what entry proof you want.
That's true.
So your water to alcohol ratio is going to affect maturation and your finished product. So
tell us the argument for a lower entry proof.
People argue that the lower entry proof, you're going to get the water interaction versus the alcohol interaction is going to pull different flavors from the barrel. So if you do low entry proof versus high entry proof, then you're not going to get as much play from the water piece of the puzzle.
Is that true, or is that just like somebody just thought of it?
No, it's true.
It's true. Okay.
Yeah. If you put the reason most of these larger companies are going in at 125 is because it costs more money to go in at 110 or 105. You put more water in the barrel, and water's not really what you want, right? It's the alcohol. So to go in at a lower proof, you're actually spending more money. You're sacrificing more money to get more of the flavor that the water essentially brings in.
Well, what would be the argument to say, well, let's just go 120 all the way. So we'll distill at 120 and we'll barrel at 120. Like, does that have an economics factor in it as well? Because, you could just go ahead and distill at 160. Like, what would be the argument of saying like we could do one or the other?
If you decided that you wanted to just distill at 120 and then go into the barrel at 120, you obviously you wouldn't have to cut anything. You would go into a tank and then directly go into a barrel. You still have to gauge to make sure you were going in at the accurate proof, but it would make your life a lot easier versus having a tank of 135 proof and then deciding you want to go into the barrel at 115. Now all of a sudden you're having to gauge that tank.
I'm assuming that there's like a major difference in the flavor of the whiskey that you're getting off the still versus something at 160 versus 120 versus 135, which is also going to equate to what you're going to be putting into the barrel. Like, is there a reason why you wouldn't just always go at 160? Or is it because you get some actual more flavor out of a lower proof off the still?
I think that's up for argument. I'm not sure. It's like the argument of pot still versus column still. There are a lot of guys who will prefer the pot still because you get the Maillard reaction. You get some of that caramelization because you're in direct contact up to the boiling point in that pot. You don't necessarily get that in your column still.
So my question was, with a lower proof versus a higher entry proof, does higher entry proof stand up to age better or like oak properties better, or does it matter? Like for long, say you're like, your goal is, I don't want to bottle this at 4 to 6 years. I want it, a 12, 15 year product. Does that matter? Entry proof matter on that?
Great question. I think it's going to be up to the individual to decide, what it is exactly that you're looking for.
Boring.
I know. Sorry.
I got an idea. Let's go buy some White Dog, and we'll just do some 12-year experiments, and we'll figure it out here.
Again, there are so many factors that really go into that, and it would take a lot of data points to, give a definitive answer, I think.
Sure, that's fair.
At the end of the day, as long as it tastes good to you.
What is your feeling, though? Or opinion? Facts are optional.
I'd have to taste it.
Yeah.
How's that?
Fair enough.
Okay.
Okay, so at this point, I think we've almost hit the whole entire part of the process, but there's one more question that comes from one of our Patreons as well. His name's Jack Johnson, and he says that, I'm curious about the end proof, right? Like when you actually go and you bottle something, and say you want to do something that's bottle and bond, and you put this huge dump and huge barrels in there, and you go and you try to add a little bit of water, and is it 100 proof? Like, is it really scientific, or like what's the leeway to say like, oh, this could be like 2 points of variable difference in here when it actually goes and gets bottled?
So the TTB regulates all of these things, and currently they're being some of these things are being revisited. But for spirits, you're allowed 0.15% or 0.3 proof below what you say on the bottle. You're not allowed to go over, because if you go over, that's tax dollars you didn't pay. But you are allowed to be under.
They don't care about the integrity. They just want their money.
I was not going to say that out loud. So, and they do go to stores and pull random samples and perform distillations to check to see that what is on the label is actually what is in the bottle.
I got a proofing question too. So like, say you have something like that's hazmat, like 140 but you're doing a big barrel dump, say like hundreds of barrels. Are they all 140 proof, or is there some that's like 120? How do you get to a final proof of 140 when you're dumping a bunch of different proofs together, I guess?
Hopefully it evens out.
Right.
It's all over the board.
Yeah.
I mean, as well as I do that 2 barrels sitting next to each other in the warehouse could be completely different from each other, even though they started life off the same distillation. There's no way to really know until you do it.
Yeah.
I mean, you dump your allotment of barrels, and wherever the proof lands, it lands. And, if you've been doing this for 100 years, you have some idea of, which floor and which rick house on which side of what farm is going to produce certain types of barrels.
I think maybe I was making it harder in my head than it actually is, but, which happens sometimes.
And so
that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And so Kevin Dillon has one last question. This kind of like brings us all full circle here. Is that like, so we've gone through the process, we've made everything, we've bottled it, blah blah blah. But how do distillers efficiently clean a column still, or just any still, or just basically all the equipment to make sure that, as you go on shutdown, like what are those things that are typically happening?
So, if you rinse your still on a regular basis after you use it, then all that stuff's not going to dry up and get crusty in there, and you're not going to have to do a real intensive clean on a regular basis. Usually what happens is the stills are cleaned with caustic, a little 2% caustic solution, whether you're doing it by hand with a hose or whether you're pumping it from a tank. In some instances, when that's not enough, you use citric acid. Especially with copper, you're going to use citric acid solutions. When you do that, you have to be careful using the citric, because copper is basically your expendable asset at this point. If you use that acid too much, it will literally eat a hole through the side of your still.
So like,
don't want that.
I got a question. Like, so older stills, like, even though you clean them and do they, I guess, produce a better or different flavor because they're older, because they're seasoned, or
it's like a good cast iron?
Yeah, like a good cast iron or a green egg that's been used for 10 years has a bunch of smoke flavors in it. Well, something. I don't know.
It's interesting if you look inside of some of these older stills that are 100 years old, that have been well taken care of and cleaned, they look new on the inside. You clean them, and each time you clean with citric acid, you pull a layer of copper off, so it looks clean again. And if you do that enough times, eventually you're going to run out of copper.
Right.
Use your copper sparingly, is what he says.
It's not a cheap fix once you've done that.
Yeah, copper is expensive.
I would think so. I mean, this has been a fantastic conversation. I learned a lot today. And not only that, is we didn't really even talk about the stuff we were sipping on. It was fantastic.
Oh, I know.
Was it batch 22 or batch 23? What would we open over there?
Can you look at that? I think it's 23 on the end.
Yes, batch 23.
Oh, Barrel
So
batch
good.
23. Oh, it's so good. I mean,
Yeah, and I was a big fan of the rye.
yes,
I
the
love
rye was fantastic.
Yes.
Absolutely.
That's rye 3. It'll be out here shortly.
Yeah, you all are putting together some awesome blends over here, man.
Thank you. We work hard and we enjoy what we do.
Yeah, no, it's fantastic. And then, I mean, you've also brought a few other things right here. So you got 21, 22, 23, I think batch 20 as well. So we'll have to go off the air and taste them and kind of give everybody our notes afterwards. But I'm sure they're all going to be home runs.
Yeah, I'm excited for this pear brandy cask finish rum. Ooh. Oh, didn't you have a rum question?
There was one rum question. Well, let's go ahead and ask it right here because I think it's something that people are interested to know about. So this is actually from Josh Shands. He said, with Barrell, I'm interested in more about their rum. Like, what is their process on picking blends of Jamaican, Martinique, Guyana, and Barbados rums? And what do they look for in the yeast for the rums, like Piombi? Do they have any thoughts on the current GI Bill going on with Barbados as well?
Damn, that's some
I know.
Wow. Sorry, sorry, Tripp. We should have just skipped
He said, I love their rum offerings and like some more light shed on those subjects.
Wow. Yeah, great question.
Talk to Joe.
Yeah. We, the rums are something we don't do a ton of by comparison. We really enjoy it. Rums are very unique in their flavors, and a lot of them used bourbon barrels, so you get a lot of the same flavors. We don't get into necessarily the actual yeast that's used in rums. We do look at some of the processes used in the different regions that create certain flavors, but as far as the yeast, we don't do much with that. But it's great to just have, a handful of different rums around, and we do it all by taste. We get, one of everything we have available to us, and we'll sit down and start putting all these blends together until we find something that we like, and then we just scale it up.
Do you really think you'd ever go into rums after doing bourbon and whiskey for so long?
I wouldn't say no. I've learned, all these years, all the things I said I would never do, I end up doing. So I've learned never to say never. How's that?
Fair enough.
That's awesome. Well, Tripp, thank you so much for coming on the show today. It was a pleasure to really pick your brain and kind of have this, like I said, we've had plenty of 100 level discussions. This is like a 201 or a 301.
Yeah, I made it a 101 with some of my questions. But,
hey, we all learn by asking. That's again, shout out to people on Patreon that ask some of these questions for us as well, because without you bring a new aspect into this too. So,
well, guys, thanks for having me. It's been great as always, and to everybody who supports Barrell, thank you for doing so. You continue to allow Joe and me and our whole team to continue doing what we're doing, so thank you for that.
Make sure you follow Barrell on the social media handles. I know they've also got an email list. You can go to barrelbourbon.com and you can get signed up there as well. We actually have an email list too. It's at bourbonpursuit.com. You go ahead and sign up and you can get notified for every new podcast release that comes out. And also follow us. You can also rate us, ratethispodcast.com/bourbon. And if you like what you hear and you want to be one of those people that ask one of these questions to one of our guests, we have Patreon, patreon.com/bourbonpursuit.
Yeah, and we love our audience, and this is what we do. We do it for you. So just keep coming with the show suggestions, feedback, comments. We love hearing from you guys. So with that, we'll see y'all next time.